So welcome everybody to the Fayette Prairie Chapter of NPAT's final talk in the series we started last year on climate change and its implications for the restoration in South Central Texas. I'll be introducing our speaker shortly, but until then I'll tell you that we're going to be offering more prairie knowledge online in the year to come, in the next 12 months. And we'll send announcements to all of our other conservation organizations, all of you who are represented here, for your calendars and your mailing list. Appreciate you all being here. You can also keep your eye on the NPAT calendar page. We're going to drop a link to that into the chat. And you can access past talks in this series on the Fayette Prairie Chapter's webpage. We're going to drop a link to that in the chat and just scroll down to the presentations tab and you can see them all. So tonight we are really honored to have Courtney Bartlett, who is a graduate assistant in the A&M University Department of Ecology and Conservation Biology. In her current research, she is focusing on the health of South Texas tidal salt flats and the ecosystems that they produce and support. She'll be telling us more about that. Before she began this research, however, Courtney worked 5 years in the private sector on utilities and renewable resource facilities. So she focused on mapping the boundaries of wetlands that must be protected from the developments, the permitting and routing, transmission and distribution lines, the substations and battery energy storage stations. So Courtney has become quite skilled at working with the regulatory systems of federal, state, and local agencies to get projects off the ground that strengthen our electrical grid and get them done in ways that protect our ecosystems. So this is such important work, Courtney, and we are delighted to have you here tonight. And so I'll turn this over to you.
Thanks, Connie. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, you're coming through.
Alrighty, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. I have some lovely photos that I would like to ensure are on there. Okay. So the topic that we have here is ecological restoration in the real world. And you may be sitting here thinking, what does that actually mean? Well, in a purely scientific point of view, we have a very idealized idea of what we would like ecological restoration or restoration of an ecosystem to look like. But very often, that doesn't always translate to real world implementation, or we can actually fall short of our perfect goal. So a bit about me. This photo is actually one of my favorites. It's when I first started out in my career. I worked at a restoration mitigation company, was interning, and this, I don't know if any of y'all have been to Louisiana, Duloc. It's on the southernmost part of Louisiana. We went past the highway, the pavement, we went past the road, and then I got in an airboat and I went about 2 hours into the swamp. And this is about an hour of walking past our boat. And so this is actually a bald cypress, tupelo, forest. So I've done a lot of work in wetlands, as Connie has mentioned. I've worked across 3 different states in person, and I have also done permitting in 5 different states. The majority of my time has been spent in Louisiana, Texas, and New Mexico, with some, forays into, I guess, 6 states: Oklahoma, Kansas, and Missouri. And I'm very passionate about restoration, ecology, as well as making sure that as humans, we're able to coexist, that we have reliable power, that people understand that just because we care about these environments or these things, or we care about our economic standing or socioeconomic issues, that doesn't mean we can't still work together. And so going back and forth between academia, consulting, academia, I've seen a lot. I've been able to talk with a lot of people about their concerns about things that have been issues. So the first thing I would like you all to do in person and online is to think about how you've seen your world change. A lot of us, I'm in my mid-20s and my parents were in their 60s and 70s, and they would tell me I used to walk to school uphill both ways. And some of those who are in the north, you might hear in the snow. So my question is, that's the joke. But in essence, like my mother, when she first moved to Houston, I mean, she would tell me about Grogan's Mill and how it never used to run as far as it did today. She had never seen development like she had seen when she moved here 30 years ago. So in a very short span of time, within 1 or 2 generations, we've seen a very large change in our world. We've seen the growth of cities. We've seen mass deforestation. We've seen fires. This is actually a fire out of Arizona that I found on the news. This is the flooding from Hurricane Harvey. I mean, we're seeing these massive natural disasters. And then this middle picture, near and dear to my heart, my lab mate took this, and this is actually erosion along my site. I mean, this is very pronounced erosion. So we're seeing all of these changes in our world. And what does that mean for us? How can we either live with, restore, or stop those changes? So to look at my restoration site, this is in Port Aransas. This is at the Nature Preserve. And my area of pronounced restoration specifically is this teeny tiny area up here. And you may think, how is that going to help your entire study area? I will get to that. But that is the area that we are recommending design criteria to Port Aransas. Now, Port Aransas identified this as an issue after Hurricane Harvey. Before Hurricane Harvey, 2017, this is a photo from March. You can see this nice little coastline here. There's not any breakthroughs. You actually see sediment building to the jetty. Little backstory for not coastal. When you have jetties, sediment deposits along landforms. So you get these big pockets of sediment. Now, after Hurricane Harvey, and this happens with many hurricanes across the world, you actually have barrier islands, which Texas has 7. This is Mustang Island. So this is going to be the Mustang Island State Park for Texas Parks and Wildlife. If anyone has been, it's fantastic. And so this is kind of at the tip. Now, after the hurricane, you can see the blowout, complete coastline gone, 3 different spots. Now, that is actually a large issue because, first off, barrier islands protect us, right? They protect Texans. There's a joke that they take the beating so that everyone else can live just fine. And there's a joke about that with Florida and Georgia as well. But in our world, what we see is now that this blowout has occurred, all this water is rushing in. And this little sediment deposit that had been happening here, which in coastal areas is removed and deposited elsewhere, it's dredge material, it all flowed into this nature preserve. This nature preserve is well loved by the area, by Texans. It provides habitat for birds and during migration, the salt flats here. There's mangroves, there's a bunch of different aspects to this area that are very important. It provides economic gains to this area as well, not just a social, cultural significance. So this is what we're theorizing to restore. The reason that we're looking at this section is actually this little section right here was actually restored by Port Aransas, and they did it as part of a rebuilding of their nature preserve. So this section was left. This section has a lot of tide in, tide out. We actually saw water flowing out of our site, which surprised us. As scientists, yes, we do get surprised. And this rock, as you can see, I mean, water could just flow over this, right? And historically, this hasn't been as low. This hasn't been as unprotected. Now that it has been blown out, you're getting a lot of water exchange. At first, you may think, that's not so bad. We like water flow. It's always good. But in this case, for a salt flat to form, you actually need an area of land to be flooded periodically, and then that water has to dry off, leaving behind the salt from the salt water. And then you have a salt flat, which is, in some people's thoughts, worthless. In mine, I tend to like it. And that provides habitat for birds, cyanobacteria, crustaceans. And it also is a very interesting place to visit. So humans enjoy it as well. Now, you may be asking me, why should we not restore this section of land? And this is where ecological restoration in the real world really comes into play. Money, time, just general scope. Sometimes in our perfect world of restoration, we don't always get everything we want. We're constrained by, like I said, money and time most of the time. And in our case, it does have to do with funding, Port Aransas's goals for this project, because this is, really what they're coming to us about, and that what can we do to help restore this area. So moving on to general benefits of restoration. When we're looking at benefits of restoration, we're actually saying, and these are only a few, but most importantly, and in my personal thoughts, hydrology, biodiversity, erosion control, economic gain, and community building. So when we look at hydrology, that involves many things. A lot of us, when we think hydrology, we think just water, and that is at its essence correct. But this can really play into water quality and groundwater infiltration. So when we see water quality, if we're having an influx of seawater into our freshwater systems, we get brackish water, things die. If we see an influx of fresh water into a salt system, we either get brackish water or we change the composition of that salty area, which can kill living things, not just plants, but animals. That impacts our economic side as well. So maintaining those benefits, that hydrology benefit, you're saying, hey, you're going to get this. In a lot of cases, that is what we focus on. Hydrology in Texas, one of the most important aspects. When we look at groundwater infiltration, that has to do with crops, has to do with ranching. It has to do with, you want to go to the lake, you want to float the river, you want to do these different things. And that all has to do with how water connects into our system. When we're looking at biodiversity, a lot of people, when we think that, we just think a bunch of different animals, or we think a bunch of different plants. But in essence, biodiversity doesn't just give us those multiple bird species that we love to watch while birding. Actually, there's a funny anecdote when it's like one day you're young and the next day you're like, is that a red-cockaded woodpecker? And you're very excited about it. And so as we get older, we want our kids, we want people around us, we ourselves want to enjoy, that aspect of biodiversity. Plants, they give multiple ecosystem functions to biodiversity. They can do carbon sequestration. They can give you, food sources. They can make sure that you have cover crops. There's many things that go into plant biodiversity in terms of like an ecosystem function aspect. And then hunting. In Texas, a lot of people are hunters. And having that biodiversity, having that ability to have a species that can not be invaded upon or be cut out because of overgrazing or because their food source is now gone, that allows for hunting to occur. And whether you do it for recreation, whether you do it for food or religious or cultural reasons, hunting is a big part of our world. And actually in Louisiana, they hunt in the swamp. So where I was standing in that photo about me, that hunting occurs. There are deer there. So it's around the world. It's around our area. In terms of erosion control, this is very, very important and very, very big in terms of restoration. As you saw in my site, that amount of sediment just moving through the entire site, that changes topsoil conditions. It changes salinity. It changes the ability for vegetation to grow. It can cause mass die-offs. And so erosion is very important. We see erosion occur all the way from the top of America. Sediment will travel all the way down our rivers, all the way through things, through wind, and it will end up in the ocean. That's how we get deltas. That's how we get those coastal ecosystem sediment accretion, as well as oceanic sediments, but we do get a lot of sediment from just our normal rivers that run through our country. And those sediments, when we do increased agriculture or we overgraze and we create barren ground, that increases erosion, similar to the photo that I showed you, where if the natural breaks or the natural plant life is destroyed or blown out, you can see increased erosion in shear erosion. You can see it in rill. So if you've ever seen a mountain that has like little divots running down it, that maybe looks like maybe it wasn't that way when you were a kid, or maybe that's something that you've always seen, but it's getting worse. It's called rill erosion. And so those types of things impact agriculture. They impact our ability to plant good crops. They impact our ability to harvest and to put our cattle and other resources that we as humans need out there. In addition, erosion control can become like plant growth. So if you have mass erosion, plants really struggle to grow. And so planting or having sustainable vegetation practices actually keeps erosion at bay, allows a system to kind of calm down, take a breath, and grow. And so that's something that in restoration, we really do focus a lot on erosion control. Another benefit is economic gain. I've kind of touched on it in the above three areas, but I think that's something that's very important in terms of agriculture. Again, disaster mitigation. You know, if we can restore a system like the coastlines and the barrier islands, that amount that we spend on that restoration is going to be a heck of a lot smaller than perhaps rebuilding an entire city, or the flood damage that's going to occur if the wave energy doesn't get slowed down on those barrier islands or those dunes. Or when we look out at prairies, putting in fire breaks, that's not really a restoration form, but it is a mitigation. And then that allows us to work better, and it allows us to stop intense wildfires so that we are not having to go back in later on and restore a system that can be very difficult to restore once burned. So those are some of the economic gains. We also put a valuation, as much as some of us may not want to put valuations on cultural or social things or plants or animals or the earth. We do put an economic valuation on that. And that has to be done in order to find funding, in order to explain to everyone across the board that, hey, these matter to us. Like this is something that the groups like, this is something the kids like, this is something everybody enjoys, this helps us in the end. So those economic gains in terms of actual physical monetary compensation as well as social compensation are very important. And that leads me into my last little benefit grouping, which is community building. You know, if you look right now, there is a lot of community within our rural communities. There's community within subdivisions, within localities. I mean, think about it at A&M. If I saw an Aggie across the world and I had an Aggie ring on and so did they, there's an instant connection there. And so that community building of restoration of, oh, hey, I did this restoration activity. Oh, hey, I have some issues. What do you see? And so this building of community, this communication, I find very important and very necessary when moving forward in restoration. And as we look to the future, I think that getting everybody involved, talking, seeing the examples that I'll show of restoration that worked is very important because it's a well-known phenomena. And I think it helps us feel good too, that when we come together and we work on a project together as a community, we grow not just our ecosystem, our economy, but we grow our social, our community itself. And that, in my opinion, is priceless. And so in terms of those economic advantages, ecologically, water is life. Water grows our crops. Water is important for boating. If any of you have ever floated in San Marcos, I mean, I like that. And that has to do with spring water, groundwater infiltration. And so that water gives a lot of economic value. If you think fishing in coastal communities, it is the reason they exist. It is the reason these people are able to feed their families and raise their children and have a life. Nutrients, that is an ecological advantage. That we are able to restore nutrient capacity or nutrient ecosystem function to maybe a prairie or grassland or even an ag field. And that will in turn give us economic advantage. Natural disaster, I touched on this a bit in the previous slide, but that natural disaster economic advantage of not having to rebuild an entire town or not having to rebuild, you know, something that maybe was horribly wrong, or if we have nuclear plants or some other type of facility that generates electricity that maybe if something happens and wipes that out, if we had done a restoration project earlier that could combat that or slow down a hurricane or a fire, then we're going to pay less in the long run. Anthropogenically, so humans, commercial, hunting, being able to build, being able to do a lot of our cattle, or just in general, having a nice walk through a prairie in Texas. We're very proud of our prairies, as I'm sure the entire group is well aware, y'all are the prairie. And so that's something that I think a lot of Texans really value and appreciate. I touched on agricultural and then human health. When you restore an area and you allow it to grow, you help water quality, air quality, nutrients, water, you give people safety, security. And that really does help us. It helps us, our parents, our grandparents, our children, our dogs. And so that is, in my opinion, that is very priceless, as much as we do put evaluation on it. We look specifically at hydrology in terms of water quality. This has been big in the news lately, especially like when we have hurricanes, you can't drink the water because water will flood the systems. It will decommission water treatment plants. If you remember back to the freeze a few years back, that was less than fun for us Texans. One of the issues in Austin, we had to boil water, and other places did as well, because when power went out, we weren't ready for it. We didn't have some of the restoration techniques to weather guard our systems and utilities, nor did we have the restoration techniques for areas that potentially needed them. And so we actually had complete facilities, water treatment facilities, go offline. And that's why we have to boil water. So that clean drinking water, we take it for granted. Every single day, a lot of us take it for granted. And yet that is an ecosystem function that we really prioritize and care about. Water for agricultural use. A lot of ag fields, they don't just get to, divert water or something like that. A lot of them do, but a lot of them have sprinkler systems. A lot of them, I actually work with a utility manager, and we know they're not called this, but they're the crop circle, where basically you have an irrigation stick in the middle, it comes out and it just rotates. And so it looks like a big crop circle. And that's how they grow their crops in a lot of places. And so water quality is very important. Low water quality, your crops aren't going to grow as well. In terms of groundwater infiltration, vegetation is what really promotes this. So if you have bare ground, and you can kind of see in this picture here, bare ground, the water doesn't always infiltrate, it runs off, it sits, it pools, but in our areas where we have vegetation, that water is slowed down. So precipitation, flooding, that slows down the water. It allows it to infiltrate into the ground. You have groundwater flow, you recharge your aquifers, you recharge lots of things. And then on top of that, vegetation has the added effect of keeping soil in place. It reduces erosion. So in that sense, making sure that we restore vegetation, or we look towards vegetation types that have deeper roots in some cases, or are going to be better for our ecosystem function, those are prioritized in a lot of restoration activities, and should be. Surface connectivity. This is very important in terms of waters of the US, making sure that there's, connectivity. If you look at the Colorado River, it doesn't reach where it used to. There's dry spots. The Rio Grande, we had issues with Rio Grande water amounts, as well as some spots of the Rio Grande are pretty dang dry. And we have farmers now who have to change their practices in South Texas to different practices to ensure that they have the water they need, because we just don't have enough surface connectivity anymore. And then Lake Travis, those of you who've been to the Austin area, you've seen potentially the lower levels of Lake Travis. And I am an avid diver. I scuba dive. And so one of the places we scuba dive in the great state of Texas is Lake Travis. And I have watched that lake drop dramatically in the last 5 years even. And so we were at record lows. And yes, water does drop, but we are seeing it more often and for more prolonged periods. Check my time here. So in regards to disaster mitigation restoration, I've touched on this a lot. That's one of my central beliefs that restoration can do, is it can really help you understand and see how we can actually help in disasters. Because we want to help people. We want to help them stay alive, we want to help them flourish, and we want to help them stay happy. So when we use ecological restoration to restore ecosystem function, that helps us mitigate disasters, wildfires, hurricanes, droughts, even floods. And all of those things, when we restore prairies or grasslands that may have, or even in deserts in New Mexico that may have had vegetation more so, and we restore that after it was lost, we see less flooding, we see less erosion, we see more infiltration. And so that can help with flooding. In terms of droughts, there are multiple case studies that actually have shown that certain levels of a plant with deeper roots can actually keep the water table in check, can actually keep hydrology where it needs to be, and can reduce drought. Hurricanes, I've talked a lot about those, and wildfires. We've seen a lot of wildfires, not just in the news lately, but also in North Texas. A lot of Texas burns, and it has a fire regime historically. But wildfires are different than a prescribed burn or than natural burning. And so we want to mitigate the damages associated with intense, out of control wildfires. And, you know, when we think fire, we're very scared. As a population, as a community, I have a red card certification. I can technically do prescribed burns. That scares me. I want nothing to do with fire. I'm a water gal all the way. So, you know, making sure that we keep the public safe by doing maybe smaller prescribed burns that are less intense can actually help us in the long run. And that actually brings me into this, prescribed burning. So this is actually a site out in, I believe it's either East Texas or North Louisiana. Like I said, I've worked all over. And so sometimes my sites blur together, but you can actually see here on these pine trees, burn marks. So this is a site that probably burned probably about a year ago, maybe a little less, and you actually have ferns. So these are ferns, maybe saplings. You can actually see a little sapling there. And this is really important because these pine forests, these pine trees, they've adapted over their life, you know, since they were created to actually withstand fire. They have a very thick bark. It allows fire to come through, low intensity fires to come through, burn. Their leaves are up higher, their needles, so they don't catch fire and they don't, you know, go up into flames, the entire tree, or catch a crown fire. And they usually have burning occur. When we have anthropogenic impacts, such as like us coming in and suppressing fire and that cultural fear of fire, you have less normal fire regimes. And their cones, a lot of them are serotinous, meaning that they don't open until after a fire comes through. Their seed banking banks on fire. And so this restoration practice of a prescribed burn, that is what keeps fuel loads down. It's what makes it so that when a fire does occur, you don't have these huge fires jumping into the crowns of the trees and spreading like wildfire across our groups, across our trees. And that keeps us safe, it keeps animals safe, and it keeps our ecosystem safe. Another fun restoration is actually something that was done from my current professor, my current advisor, Dr. Rusty Fagan. This is only a couple of pictures from his restoration work, but this was out in the Magnolia Inlet. And this was through mechanical restoration means, meaning that they actually dug out this entire little like blockage here. And what that actually ended up doing was when they did this, along with some other mechanical means, they didn't have a very big budget. I mean, they had less than $500,000. You may say, well, that's a lot for a restoration project or anything. really and truly, that's not that much in terms of what you could spend. And they were able to, with certain means, they had to work with multiple agencies. They had to go through a whole line of project permitting, which as a permitting person now, I do know the arduous process and the studies that go into this. And they removed this, which actually ended up saving about 5 square miles of marsh and restoring 5 square miles. And so you have a small little sections creating big impacts. And that's kind of what I'm hoping for in my restoration site, is that maybe some of our small impacts, maybe we can't do it all, but small portions of it, we are able to go ahead and restore. And that can have a larger impact. And in this specific instance, there was actually some stakeholder issues in which they were not able to remove certain oysters. So some of the issues was dead old oysters were creating a blockage, which didn't allow water to come through, which was raising salinity levels, killing fish. Overall, not great for this area. So what they did was, because they were having issues with permitting of the removal of these oysters, they crushed them up, they dried them out, they crushed them up, and they actually raised the evacuation route of this area so that when there is intense flooding or there are these hurricanes or something is going on, a disaster, people can get out safer. And that is a cost-effective way to not only finish out a mitigation restoration project, but to help our local communities. So all of that is to say that public policy and communication are really at that central, building block of how we get restoration to occur. No restoration project can occur without community involvement. And that community involvement may just be a one-on-one. That may be a landowner talks to a researcher here at A&M or another place, another institution, and states, hey, I'm seeing this on my land. I'm seeing less deer. I'm seeing less productivity, or something came through and we have a bunch of issues now. This community, that one-on-one, maybe that's the institution researcher going, okay, well, I have a grad student and they are interested in this topic. Or you may have another professor that's interested and they go out and that land is then used as a researching tool or as a restoration project in general. There are also restoration companies as well as just normal research as what I'm doing. And some of those planning and those things, they have to come together for a community, because a lot of restoration, such as Port Aransas, this went through years to be restored. Hurricane Harvey was back in 2017. We're in 2025 and we're doing the planning for it. We're doing the data to make sure that our restoration techniques are likely going to work. And so that's a long time. Policy, communication, and that is one of the central drivers of why restoration can take so long, or people may think that restoration isn't working, because it may take a long time. If we think about it, trees, 15-year-old tree, pine tree, it's pretty big. But then you look at an oak tree at 15 years, you're like, oh, not so big. They are slow growing. They need some time. The earth, it takes the time it takes. And humans, we like to speed things up. Just ask me. I have been going since I was basically born. And so that community involvement is really important. Reaching out to the communities, reaching out, holding public forums. And when you say that, there's always in a regulatory, consulting, researcher sense of, we're going to get a bunch of people who are going to come yell at us. And that happens. I've been to public forums where they have been very upset. And I think something that as researchers, we often forget, or consultants or any kind of group going into a community, that these people live, work, and raise their families in this area. And so coming in with a gracious smile, asking the community, like, what have you seen your land used as? What are your plans? What are your goals? What do you need? And then in terms of an actual restoration project, that can come in like mine, where we do some but not all. Or we say, okay, you really need this ecosystem function, so we're going to focus our efforts on that. And then there are other things that we'll need to do in order to maintain that or keep it. But, we can prioritize what a community needs. Because at the end of the day, it is my true belief, deep down, that everybody wants to work together. We all want the same thing. We want health, happiness, economic stability. And so that is a central driver for a lot of people. So coming into a community, being calm, cool, collect, that is the best thing we can do. And if you are a landowner and you are coming to our public meetings, and you're on this call, be nice. We're trying to help, or we're trying to do our jobs, or we're trying to further research or further the ecosystem that is what you live in. We're trying to make it better or trying to maintain it so that you can continue your way of life or your, goals and aspirations. So from a community level, there's a lot that can go on. And I could probably talk for forever on communities, so I will move on. But at a local level, it is a little different. That's going to be your city, county, that kind of thing. At a state level, different states have different federal laws, different states have different laws. They have different environmental requirements. They have different checks and balances. Here in Texas, we have TCEQ for hydrology and other things. And on the coast, you have the GLOW, and you have other entities that have a stake. In terms of federal, a lot of funding and policies that have been in place in terms of like federal aid that might be on hold or something might happen. But that's something where as a community, we say, no, like this is important to us. We lobby for ourselves. We say, this is what we need. We need restoration. We want restoration. Help us get this. And we tell them there's economic gain to this. There's cultural, social benefit to this. And we need to come together as a community. All practitioners, consultants, scientists, landowners, all stakeholders need to come together when we're working towards building a better environment and better world for ourselves. So outreach and communication, as I've previously stated, one of my favorite things. That's something that I think has been really great. Connie touched on it. I've been around the block for various different things, utilities, and making sure that people have reliable power. That really was something and something that I'm very passionate about because I know that it can be done, and I know that it can be done with environmental responsibility. And so that landowner researcher communication that I talked about in the last slide, I've gone out to landowners and they have been less than thrilled I'm there. They have put signs up saying that if I enter their property, I will not leave their property. I've had coworkers had dogs, weapons brandished at them. And, to an extent, you understand. But I've also met some really great people. There's actually a gentleman, I was working on a solar field, and he actually came out and he and I actually bonded over our love of dairy because we both really love milk. And it sounds silly, when you sit there and think, oh, I just bonded with a landowner over milk, and an old TV show that both of us had watched, the Andy Griffith Show. Some of y'all have seen it, some of y'all haven't. So, we sit there and we bond over that, but that really matters. It matters that they know who you are as a person. And it helps when you know who they are as a person. AgriLife Extensions is fantastic. There are local AgriLife Extensions. There's the main, group. And if there is a concern or question you may have, AgriLife Extension can really help you out in terms of documentation, case studies, someone to talk to. And just looking around your local restoration, there could be local restoration groups, naturalist groups. And so that's something that's really important, I think, for people to see is like, there are things out there. And now that we have Google or even some of the AI, some of the kids use now, that is something that, you can find pretty easily. And if you are struggling with it, there is somebody in your community, hopefully, that can help you. And if not, you can always reach out. And then the education piece. I think this is probably my second favorite other than outreach is education. I think that the goal and the key to a sustainable planet and to a community that respects and understands and loves each other, not just at our base familial unit, but as Texans, as Americans, as a world, is that education piece. How do we know that we're potentially able to restore something if we don't know what it should be restored to. And so that's where us researchers come in. We want to learn, we want to see what we can do, and educating children on the joys and the love of prairies, grasslands, coastlines. There are some kids who have never seen the ocean. There are some kids who have never gone into complete wilderness. I go backpacking with my dog and it gets dark. And there are some people who've never experienced being out in the wilderness pretty much alone. And not to say that that's bad, but to say that those are those different experiences. And if someone's never seen something, they don't know. And as from my own experience, I guess you could call me a city slicker as a kid. I went hiking with my father. I went out to the woods. I played in the woods, but I lived in Houston. I moved to Minnesota. I lived in a town, and then I started working with horses on a Egala ranch. And then from there, I moved into biology and ecology and restoration. And I started going out on 10-day long field assignments out in the middle of Louisiana. And so, when you spend 90% of your time in the outdoors, you see these things, you feel these things. And there are some that spend their entire time out there. And so that's why I think it's very important, that education piece, that outreach, that communication, bringing us all together, in my opinion, is really important. So this is my questions and discussion time. And let me make sure you can see this, because this little guy is my favorite guy I've ever seen out in the field. It's a wild baby hognose. And hognose, they are known for turning over and playing dead. This little guy was very feisty, and he decided that he was going to curl up and hiss at me. And then he promptly ran away, or slithered away. So I just wanted to add that into, there's a lot out there in the world. So any questions, discussion? I wanted to leave a little bit of time for that, just because I covered a very broad range of topics.
Wow, yes. Thank you, Courtney. You did. I have questions, but I'll make room for somebody else to jump in first and ask a question.
Anyone over here?
And just if you just shout, just unmute yourself and just ask the question.
So I had a quick one for you, Courtney. So hi, I'm Steve Wood from Brett McDonald. But I guess you talked a lot about the successes, and I was wondering, on the flip side of that, what are some major pitfalls that you've seen inside of ecological restoration and methods to avoid them?
Yep. So it's a great question, Steve. Thank you. And that does occasionally happen. I say occasionally. It probably happens more than we know in terms of what gets published, what doesn't. Some general examples are going to be when we culled wolves and for livestock, for those kinds of things. And then we realized that was a large mistake. And I mean, technically, I guess you could consider the back half of that a success of reintroducing wolves has actually decreased deer populations or moose populations and actually allowed ecosystems to fix themselves. But I would argue that removing them is also a restoration tool for social. In terms of absolute restoration, there was a study conducted on streams, and there was a shrub woody encroachment thing. And people were like, that's why the amount of water is going down. So if we remove those shrubs, trees, we're going to have better water. We're going to have more water. Unfortunately, the exact opposite was true. When they removed those, they actually saw a decrease in water, and that was surprising for researchers. One of the biggest things we see is, okay, well, grasses don't use as much water, trees do, this shouldn't be here, let's remove it. And so there's that piece of it of recognizing that in this instance we were wrong. Not always, but in this, and not every situation will need the same technique. And if you are wrong with a restoration technique, I do think there has to be a little bit of grace, a little bit of ability to look at it and say, oh, I was wrong, and accept that, move on from it, and say, what can I do to fix this error? And that can be devastating potentially, right, for some people, or it can be frustrating if you spend a lot of money doing something. But I do think that to an extent, not doing anything, just allowing a system to keep going, or if you do a restoration technique and it fails, just allowing it to sit, I personally think that's worse. I think one of our goals as humans is stewardship of our land. It's stewardship of accountability for what we do and for the world we live in as a predominant species. And just as the fact that, when we look at restoration, humans are, they're a big part, so that's what I would say in terms of if there's failure. And that was just a case study, which I can send Connie if anyone's interested. I can find the paper and send it out, but there are definitely cases of failed restoration. And it's a relatively new field. So give us some space, give us some grace. We're doing our best just like everyone else.
Yeah, kind of like what is it, test or well, Edison, 99 ways not to make a light bulb, except in this case you're making a ecosystem, so a little bit more difficult, I imagine.
Just a tad with the complexity of the world. I mean, obviously we couldn't make it. Someone else did. So that's kind of that moment of, I don't think I can comprehend. So the
Thank you for
complexity.
that.
Mhm.
Humility, important quality to have if you're trying to restore something.
Exactly.
Courtney.
Linda,
Sorry.
I think you raised your hand and said you had a question.
Yes,
Sorry.
I do. I have a question, and it's not, I don't know if it's particularly climate change, but we live here in the Lost Pines, and I've noticed a great change in the forest, the wooded area because of the pine beetles.
Yep.
And I'm wondering if there is some kind of outreach that we could do before we have to do a complete restoration, that we can get it, what you say, mitigate it before it gets to where the wooded area starts thinning out and we're going to lose it.
So there's actually many case studies on beetle and those species that are highly pathogenic. They are very, as you know, bad. So there's multiple case studies on that. There's a variety. It's not my area of expertise. But I will say there are many case studies that you can look into, as well as reaching out to, there's multiple professors that have done work on this, not just at A&M, but UT, TU, I guess, for the A&M people out there, and other, universities. But some things that I have seen is when you have intense outbreaks, or you can tell that something's happening. They have had some success from things I've read. Once again, I am not an expert, in clearing out certain areas or strips to kind of reduce that impact so that it's not so close together. But in terms of outreach, yes, there's a lot you can do. Reach out to your local researchers, your local professors, as well as there are experts on some of this stuff that, if they have research opportunities or there's something like that, I mean, they're going to jump on it. Funding is always an issue, right? But in terms of research, we're more than happy to figure out a way or implement a strategy that has worked in the past. But I would recommend, as you stated, reaching out to your community, stating this is an issue. Because like I said, a lot of people, they don't go in the woods. I mean, and I actually just drove through there the other day. And I was sitting there going, oh, wow, this has been restoring beautifully over the last, a few years since the fire. And to hear, the beetles, that's definitely something that I think people, because those lost pines, I mean, that is something that is integral to your community. That is very important in terms of economic gain, in terms of, I would assume, social, cultural. It's part of you. Your community is part of you. And so I would definitely reach out to community, raise awareness. And that can also help you with funding if necessary, or policy allocation of funds potentially to handle this, because it would cause a larger economic loss to lose your forest than to, on the front end, load that funding into a restoration technique that could potentially help. And if it doesn't help, then you know that you tried. And I think there's that hindsight is 2020. But more people than not are often upset that they never tried something and let it happen than, that it didn't work.
Thanks, Linda. Jill, were you going to ask a question?
Hi, yeah, actually, I was gonna make a point to the fact that failed restoration is still a success if you learn from what those failures were, so you can apply them moving forward into a next step. And those are the type of things that, bringing back to what you were saying, Courtney, about education, that by expanding on our knowledge base and educating folks about it, both successes and failures, allows for a better understanding and potential starting point for your next endeavor. So
No.
it's always a great way to look back and evaluate, even if you consider it a unsuccessful. There may be something to gain. There's usually something to gain from it.
No, Jill, it's a really exactly. And so I think that's something that as a society, I mean, you can look at me as a little Miss Perfectionist for most of my life. I'm still working on that. But I like to do things right and right the first time. When I was a kid, I had parents, my mother's in her 60s. My father would have been in his late 70s. So I had a different generation of parents than most people my age. And something that was very prominent in their lives that they instilled in me at a young age, not maliciously, and I think as a society it's not malicious, is that if you don't do it right, don't do it at all. And that was something that was often said to me. And so I do think sometimes there's this fear of failing and what that means, and that it's better to not do something if you're going to fail at it. But as Jill's stating, and Stephen even said, was it's not really failure. It's learning what's going to work and not work, especially as a lot of restoration is case dependent. And having that humility, that grace to say, I learned from this, what can I do to improve? We have 7 minutes if there's any other questions.
Yeah, so I have a question. So, hi everybody. My name is Megan Carlin. I'm also with Burns McDonnell. So, Courtney, you talked a lot about as kind of your case studies and everything outside of your research, how a lot of the locations that you've worked in were in like Louisiana and Texas, so on and so forth. How would you say that your experience, I guess, working in industry kind of changed your perspective on restoration as a whole, as now you have, transitioned into more of an academic setting?
No, it's a really great question. And Connie kind of touched on that. And I do think that when I first I turned 21 a month before I graduated from college, my undergrad. And I was bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, out there to restore the entire world. Nothing could stop me. And I won't say that that's gone. As y'all have probably gathered, I am a pretty optimistic person when it comes to people restoration, more optimistic than a lot of people think I should be, given everything I've seen and done. But I do think that being in industry, it didn't necessarily take away my belief or desire in restoration. I think really and truly it aided it. It allowed me to see outside of the case studies, the pure hard data, the hard science, what people need. It helped me connect, and having been all over the country and for work as well as pleasure and going out of the country, diving, those kinds of things, I think it really just gave me a greater appreciation for people, for their plights, for their goals. And when it comes to like utility lines, a lot of what we say is, oh, we'll just restore it. But sometimes that's not the best method. And so I think in industry, sometimes there's this aversion to implementing things due to cost. And I think that in academia, there's an aversion to destroying things because we're, environmentalists. We love ecology. We love something. But I do think that being in industry and being in academia has really helped me connect the two together and know that there has to be give and take. And that at the end of the day, doing your best at something and making some concessions potentially is going to be better than not doing anything at all. In like my own case study, it's going to be better, we hope, than doing nothing at all. And so I just think that it's really helped me feel more connected to people and feel more humility for what people go through and what their livelihoods are. Gets me out of the office.
Courtney, when you meet with landowners, what are you finding to be the biggest hurdle or the greatest need for alignment so that they can feel like you're on their side or addressing something that they're seeing a need for?
Yeah. So in terms of science research, a lot of times when we do research on a private plot or something, that landowner reached out to us. They recognized an issue. They said, can you help? We listen to that issue and we go out there and we do our research. When it comes to a consulting or utility side, I have seen more issues resolved by good communication early and often versus just trying to push something through. And there is definitely a chance, especially with new projects or new restoration projects, that there are people that are going to be very upset, very worried, very scared. A common adage is that anger comes from fear. And so I think that when you approach a landowner or you approach a situation and they're worried, they don't want this on their land. They're worried that you're going to make their land worse, or they don't understand the need for it. Even if they know change has happened, maybe in their mind, it's not that bad. As we sit there with things for long enough periods of time, it just becomes normal to us. I can tell you that there is a piece of mail sitting on my walkway when I walk into my house that I have looked at every day for 2 weeks. And at this point, I don't even notice it anymore. And if I can do that in my own home, what about somebody who owns thousands of acres or hundreds of acres? Maybe they don't reach that end of their acreage every single, day or something. And so slowly over time, they get used to where they're at. And so I do think that communication, education, and side note, I do want to thank everybody on the call, whether you're in consulting, I know we've heard a couple of those, researchers, people who are within the Prairie Society, schools, etc. I do want to thank everybody for joining and furthering your education in this matter and just really opening up to it, because that I do think is helpful with landowners as well. All right, we are at 6:59. If there's any last minute questions, feel free to throw them out real quick. If not, and you just want to email Connie and don't want to throw your voice on the recording, I understand. And I would answer any questions after this if wanted or needed.
Well, thank you, Courtney. It's a great presentation. We appreciate your time tonight and really everything you're doing. I think people in research and working in the education field like you are basically saving our world, and we appreciate what you do for that. I'm really intrigued with your salt flats project, and so I don't want to keep everybody late, but I personally am rather interested in knowing just a little bit more about why salt flats are important and what lives on salt flats.
No, and anyone who needs to drop off, feel free. But in terms of why salt flats are important, so I kind of gave you a quick synopsis of why they actually form. And they're important because they do a lot of ecosystem services. And what an ecosystem service is actually something that provides value, right? It gives value, it's that service. So in terms of salt flats, you actually have stopovers for a lot of migrating birds, especially on our coast. I mean, that's probably what y'all have heard, that the wetlands on our coast are vitally important for those migrating birds. That's because they fly for long, long, long periods of time, and then they need to rest. And so salt flats provide habitat for sand piping plovers, which are a species that is under protection. Their numbers have decreased. And so those go on mud flats, but they've also been found on salt flats, including at the Port Aransas Nature Preserve. So that's a win-win for us. We help this out, the birds get help. It's also a great area for various crustaceans, small invertebrates, things that you don't really think of as cute or worth protecting, or really something that you think about on a daily basis. It's kind of like, it's like the worms and the grubs of the ocean, but sometimes even smaller. And those things do provide food for birds. They provide cycling of nutrients and nutrients that could be something as simple as, nitrogen, or something that's actually specifically based to the ecosystem that it's in. So it doesn't always have to be this like, oh, it's fertilizer. No, a nutrient is something that helps an environment. And so that can be different based on your environment. Additionally, we also see cranes, like large birds. So when I was actually out at my site in December, I'll be going back soon. I almost put this photo in, I should have. But actually on the flats, there's also like algal covering, which is, if you saw in the red boxes of my study area, we're looking at why salt flats occur versus algal flats. Like what is that? Because we've seen it across. I have actually 2 other study sites that were not restoration per se focused. But of those sites, we actually see that birds, they're very common. I know I keep coming back to the birds. But you can actually see all of their little footprints in the sand and the salt, like the salt flat areas, which is like sand with higher salinity content. And so you can actually see their little feet. And we actually saw raccoon tracks. We saw, I don't know if it was deer, but a large mammal of some kind. We saw those tracks. So there are lots of things that do migrate in and out of these areas. And we also saw tadpoles from the tides. And it really just depends on your salt flat as well. There are inland salt flats. I'm a coastal salt flat person. Nothing against inland, just not my jam. And so I think it's just really cool to see all the different species. And on top of that, it provides a break for wave attenuations, like wave energies. I'm looking at you again because you're up here now. But basically, like, when you have land and water hits it, it slows water down. So that's part of that barrier island. And they are known to slow water down. And they just provide a unique habitat that is just really cool. So.
Well, thanks. It's just a part of the ecosystem that I just did not have a lot of familiarity with. So I appreciate that explanation. I'll actually, next time I'm at the coast, I'm going to keep my eye out for one. I'll have more appreciation.
They're really cool ecosystems, and we don't have as much of them here, just based on just various ecosystem factors, flooding, salinity, etc. But there are many coastal salt flats. There's some in Mexico. Actually, my advisor, Dr. Fagan, has worked on some in Kuwait. And so you have these. It's so interesting to see that this isn't just like this little niche habitat in Port Aransas. No, it's all over. And so there is a lot of potentiality for this research that I'm doing and Dr. Fagan is doing to actually be applicable to looking out past just Port Aransas.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you very much, Courtney. We really appreciate your time tonight, sharing your research with us. Just helping remind us of the importance of restoration. We all kind of live for that too. So thank you for everything you're doing and for being here tonight.
No, thank you all for having me. And it was great, communicating with Connie and everybody else. The questions that y'all had were great. And if anyone's ever confused on something or wants to, kind of ask more questions, shoot me an email. I'm pretty email orientated. As I fixed my email. Connie knows I had issues for a while. But no, I'd love to hear. And if there's anything that you think that I could help with, or that you think that there could be case studies that might be interesting, let me know. I can shoot you over something. And if I can't, I know someone who can. So.
Thank you. And good
Thanks,
night, everybody.
All right. Bye, y'all. Have a nice night.
Bye.
Have a good night.